mid-90s, just for a little while, it seemed as though Donkey Kong ruled the gaming world. The franchise and its characters seemed at times to surpass even Mario as the de facto face of Nintendo. Flash forward to the late 2000s though, and it was tough to be a Donkey Kong fan. More than a dozen years had passed since the last entry in the mainline country series. The GameCube era saw the franchise bound to a gimmicky bongo controller, an era when the best offerings were remakes of games from days gone by. Aside from that, more and more, it seemed like Donkey Kong was no longer a franchise player, he was just an ancillary part of the Mario cast. And by the end of the decade, it was getting tough to be a traditional Nintendo fan.
We would like to play.
Early on, the Wii was very well supported with games for the casual and hardcore alike, but when it became obvious just how overtly the console had caught fire with people who didn't consider themselves gamers, the company doubled down on that demographic. And look, I'm not a gatekeeper for real gamers or whatever. I thought it was awesome that I had games I could play with my parents. It just felt like it may have been coming a little bit at the expense of people who'd been longtime fans of the company. I remember a year where it seemed like all Nintendo had was Animal Crossing. Like that was supposed to be enough for us, while Nintendo worked on Wii Music and Wii Fit and the freaking Vitality sensor. But, you know, water under the bridge, I'm not going to be bitter. The point is, Nintendo was so successful with this strategy that by 2010, even gamers who didn't give a crap about Nintendo had reason to be anxious. Sony and Microsoft had seen the Wii's success, and they were dipping their toes in that big blue ocean. So it's kind of funny. At the very same E3 where its competitors were promoting the newest of the industry's many attempts to turn you into the controller, Nintendo of America's Reggie Fils-Aimé stood on stage and said this.
As you know, Retro Studios in Texas has produced some great Metroid titles. But when they said they were ready for something new, we asked them to take one of the most treasured franchises in video game history and to make it magic again. If you listen, you can hear it coming.
That music, that landscape, I couldn't believe it. It didn't make any sense, it didn't compute, it seemed impossible. But it was real. Donkey Kong Country returns. The fact that they included that country branding was such a good sign. Jungle Beat had just been ported to the Wii the previous year, so the way that game went out of its way to avoid referencing the Country trilogy was, like the banana, fresh in everyone's mind. We took it almost as given that Nintendo wasn't interested in promoting or building on anything that Rare had created. It's a lot like how the Metroid fandom became extremely cynical toward Nintendo after Other N. That's where DK fans were at the time. And that's exactly why this reveal caught everyone so off guard. To have the president of Nintendo of America acknowledge that the series had been mishandled, that they wanted it to be magic again, this wasn't just surprising, it was vindicating. Immediately after the conference, of course, people became skeptical of Retro Studios' ability to recapture what made the Donkey Kong Country trilogy so magical after 14 years. Yeah, they weren't turning it into a first-person coconut shooter, but they had also never made anything other than this. We may have been vindicated, but were we selfish? Were we wrong? Hey, it was the 2000s. Let's find out. The story begins not on a dark and stormy night, but on a bright and cheery day when the active volcano that was apparently beneath Gorilla Glacier explodes. We'll mourn the loss of Slipslide Ride, but the eruption has unleashed something far more heinous. The Tiki Tak Tribe. This ancient assortment of sentient flying musical instruments immediately starts hypnotizing the wildlife of DK Island and enlists them to, for some reason, steal the banana horde. But their particular brand of hypnosis doesn't have any effect on Donkey Kong, probably because he underwent occlumency training after that incident with the toy factory. Oops. And from there, it just goes seamlessly into gameplay, as the first thing you're asked to do is violently hammer the Wii Remote to violently hammer DK's unwelcome guest. No dialogue, no more cutscenes. Given what a sought-after possession the Banana Horde was, this inciting incident is more than enough. I've always been less than thrilled, though, with the Tiki Tak Tribe themselves, especially as the primary antagonists. I guess it's a unique concept, theming them all around instruments like this, but those masks don't really allow for the expressive characters that made the Kremlings so memorable. And I want to stress, I'm not deriding them just because they're not the Kremlings. They just seem to be designed for functionality first, for giving you enemies with wide, flat heads to bounce on, and the designs all kinda run together. But the Tiki Tak Tribe's reception pales in comparison to by far the most controversial thing about not just this game, but the console it's on: the Waggle Controls. In the 16-bit games, tapping the Y button would make the Kongs do some kind of rolling attack, and keeping it held would make them sprint. In this game, your character's speed is determined by the analog stick, which, makes sense. But you don't hit a button to roll. No, don't be ridiculous. That would just be silly. No, instead, a function that you'll need to precisely time multiple times throughout every single stage of the game is relegated to flicking the Wii remote. And you know what? It didn't bother me even a little. No, seriously, it felt like second nature by the second level. I didn't mistime it, I didn't activate it when I didn't want to, and I thought it actually felt pretty immersive when it was used to, beat up bosses. The reason I was in a position to get the hang of it so fast, though, is because by 2010, many Wii games had used a flick of the Wiimote as part of their control scheme. So to me, it was already as natural as hitting a button. On the other hand, all of those other games had some kind of a reason to limit the control scheme to the Wii remote. In Twilight Princess, you were mimicking a sword. New Super Mario was mimicking the NES controller. Mario Galaxy required the pointer, and Mario Kart, amazing as it seems, actually let you use different controllers. But with Returns, you're locked to the Wii remote. It is absolutely ludicrous that on a system with a Pro controller that looks this much like a Super Nintendo pad, a 2D revival of a Super Nintendo series couldn't support it. The forced Waggle controls might not have bothered me, but failing to give the player the option was a tone-deaf decision that introduced an unnecessary learning curve, and even kept some people from giving the game a chance. If you fall into that camp, the game was remade for the 3DS a few years later, and on that version, all the Waggle mechanics are mapped to buttons. Unfortunately, the trade-off is that it suffers from a much lower frame rate. The Wii version is 60 FPS, but the 3DS struggles to maintain its target of 30. But it is really impressive that they got it running with no other consequences on this hardware, and if you're into that sort of thing, and I really am, the 3D effect is a natural fit for the game too. Some people swear by this version, and there are a few very substantial additions that we'll get to later, but aside from one big one, I'd take Waggle over a low frame rate any day. Of course, if you've got a beefy enough PC, the Dolphin Emulator can give you the best of both worlds and beyond. The bulk of what you're seeing here was played on Dolphin, with the same controller layout as the 3DS version, at 60 FPS with a massive upscale in resolution, and a fan-made HD texture pack for the 2D HUD elements. It looks gorgeous, controls perfectly, and even a rig that's a few years out of date should be able to run it at a higher res than the Wii at this point. I would call this the definitive way to play the game, if your computer can handle it. But I digress. Even if Returns had supported this controller, it still wouldn't have played like the Super NES games. This is not a retro throwback. This is a whole new style of Donkey Kong Country, and it handles a lot of things differently. Donkey Kong himself just feels different. He moves and jumps with the weight and might you'd expect of a gorilla. Dashing from a standstill has a little scampering build-up, and bouncing on enemies isn't as floaty as it was in the originals. Also, you can no longer bounce higher off enemies just by holding the jump button. You've got to time it consistently, and combined with how frantic the game can get anyway, I find the window on that is a little too strict. One of the best changes, though, is how climbing works. DKC had vines and ropes, but Returns has entire surfaces that you can cling to without any change in DK's momentum. These surfaces can even curve, and it adds a lot to stage variety. There's no longer much of an emphasis on barrels, and even aside from the Waggle, rolling works completely differently. In the 16-bit titles, rolling through an enemy would extend both the speed and length of your attack. It was where a lot of that flow came from, as you could barrel through groups of enemies and build momentum. In Returns, Donkey Kong's roll has been, nerfed, really. Rolling in general is one of the biggest reasons this game feels so different, because rolling is also significantly faster than just running. So if you're going for speed, it's better to leap out of a roll to maintain that speed instead of barraging through enemies with it. It's not a smooth, flowing maneuver anymore, it's an explosive burst of momentum, and unless you jump, it only lasts for this long, whether you hit enemies with it or not. One signature of the classic trilogy was the way that instead of relegating player functions to like an in-game menu, a cast of characters were attached to those services. Cranky Kong gave you hints, Funky let you travel the map, Candy saved your game, and a floating star barrel served as your level checkpoint. Wait, that last one doesn't fit, does it? It's because in Returns, this pig is now your level checkpoint. But Retro only captured this particular focus to an extent. The fact is, Cranky didn't just give you hints, he antagonized you and broke the fourth wall. Funky was a dude. Candy was a love interest and an abomination. They might have been one-dimensional, but the Kongs were all characters. This pig, on the other hand, didn't even have a name and wouldn't get one until the sequel. Speaking of Cranky though, he's the one Helper Kong that actually makes a return in DKC Returns. While it would have been nice if more had made an appearance, I can understand it. All their function had been made obsolete by the evolving standards of game design. You can jump around the map screen at any time, so you don't need Funky. The game autosaves, so you, mercifully, don't need Candy. All that's really left to do is run a shop, and since Cranky is the most memorable of the bunch, it makes sense that he would get the job. One other signature of the DKC series was its tag team dynamic, and so for the first time since 1995, Diddy Kong was used as DK's sidekick. But the tag team is now more of a Texas tornado. Diddy isn't really a separate playable character anymore, at least not in single player. You're always controlling Donkey Kong, and when you have him, Diddy rides on DK's back. So he works more like a traditional power-up, giving you access to more abilities and going away when he takes enough damage. Such a change necessitates that those abilities are worth it, and oh, they are. The roll move when you have Diddy is massively buffed. It just barrels along the ground, and can go on as long as the terrain does. And of course, you can still go over a ledge and jump out of a roll. Diddy also comes with his rocket barrels, letting you get more distance and more importantly, more control out of your jumps. But one downside to making Diddy more of a power-up than a second character is that stages no longer have to feature him. It's not uncommon for you to be able to pass a checkpoint with Diddy, but if you die, there's no way you're getting him back. It's not necessarily a negative, but it is a little awkward that the only way to have another shot with him is just to go to another stage and get him. Well, unless you're playing multiplayer. The 16-bit games had a couple different ways to let you switch off in multiplayer, but I never covered those modes. I mean, it was nice that it was there, but it felt a bit tacked on. And I mean, I guess it had to be, given how the games were designed. But in Returns, both players play co-op at the same time. Unlike the 90s trilogy, and unlike certain newer 2D platformers, it actually feels for the most part that this game was designed with two-player in mind. You never collide with each other, and defeated enemies even stick around for a few seconds, so both players have an opportunity to bounce on them. The second player can hop on DK's back at any time if a section gets too tough, and you can spend a life to come back instantly if one of you dies. The only time it does get a little dicey is in the minecart and rocket barrel stages, but these would have to lose a lot to be playable simultaneously, so I don't mind it. My initial playthrough of this game was pretty much all done in multiplayer, and it was a blast. This is how you do a co-op platformer. The first game had this weird little move called the ground pound. It was fun, I guess, but it was really situational. It could uncover hidden items, but not the ones that were visibly buried. It was just an odd ability, and it was totally possible to get through the whole game without ever using it. No surprise, the sequels did away with it entirely. Until now, the ground pound in Returns is one of the most important moves in your repertoire. It doesn't have that weird wind-up and delay anymore. It's totally instant, and it has to be because it's used for so many things. It can still uncover items, but it can also stun enemies, demolish terrain, and activate set pieces. It makes a lot of sense, bringing Donkey Kong's strength to the forefront of his moveset, and I love it. But kind of the opposite of the ground pound is the blowing mechanic. Where the ground pound feels great and makes sense for the character, blowing on things is a clunky maneuver requiring you to awkwardly position yourself next to things. It's also more laggy than the ground pound, and I really question what sort of thought process would lead to this being a sensible move for Donkey Kong. It's occasionally used for some cool moments, and it's neat when it's used to blow out the fire enemies, but mostly I just feel like it has too much overlap with ground pounding without being anywhere near as fun. Since the actual result of what they do is so similar, ground pounding and blowing can lead to a lot of starting and stopping, which, if you let them, break up the flow of the gameplay. You could be totally immersed in the feel of the game, only to be pulled out if you need to break that thing or blow on that dandelion. Now, like I said, they're also used for a lot of set-piece moments or discovering hidden rooms, but I do feel like stages are filled with way too many background elements that only exist to justify these moves. And I mean, it's at least a plus that each stage archetype has its own things to break or blow on, but a lot of them don't even give you anything. However, I can kind of excuse this potential interruption of flow for a couple of reasons. For one thing, it's only potential. There's absolutely no reason you have to search out everything. One of the many things the original trilogy did well was nailing that balance and allowing the player to choose between action and exploration. If you wanted to barrel your way through levels with all the finesse of a pounding drum, you'd have a blast. But if you wanted to take your time, soak in that ambience, and find all the secrets, that could be just as fun. The games were accommodating to either approach. Donkey Kong Country Returns recaptures this balance, and it might even do it better in some ways. Every Every single level is brimming with secret areas to discover and things to collect, but every single level is also designed in such a way that a skilled player can barrage through them with a speed and grace worthy of the aesthetic, and in fact they have to be built with speed in mind. There's a new time trial mode with a ludicrously high skill ceiling, which actually requires you to master every single beat of a level. But maybe the greatest indication of this approach to balance is in two of the collectibles, Kong letters and puzzle pieces. The Kong letters aren't really hidden. They're in plain sight, but they tend to require the player to pull off a risky move to get them. But they don't grant an extra life anymore. Instead, getting every Kong letter in a world unlocks a K-Temple stage. This is one of those bits of new series lore that really fits the idea that the Tiki's revival sparked these temples to appear. I love the ancient technology aesthetic, but I love playing them even more. Look, the game is normally tough, but these stages just drive you crazy. They ask so much of you. The mechanics all come together and there's so much tension and pressure and you just die over and over again. But it's exhilarating, and all that challenge makes getting to the end so satisfying. But let's set that aside for now and contrast that with the new collectible, puzzle pieces. Unlike the Kong letters, you'll have to actively search for them. They're hidden throughout the stages themselves, but they're also rewards for completing bonus stages. Collecting them will unlock, well, a bonus. Stuff like a piece of concept art or a diorama. Look, like I said a billion times in the Metroid series, I'm not a completionist. So my approach to puzzle pieces is simple. I'll get them if I come across them, but I never go out of my way to find them all. I mean, look, the Kongs don't even mind losing bonus stages anymore. But that's kind of the beauty of it. You out-challenge, you'll get more of it as a reward for proving your skill by grabbing those Kong letters. Would you rather explore? You'll also be rewarded with bonus content. Do you maybe want to find everything, but you suck at actually doing so like I do? Cranky lets you hire squawks, who will help seek out puzzle pieces. Is the game's difficulty overwhelming? Cranky also sells power-ups that protect you from crashes, give you more hit points, and even make you invincible. The 3DS version even adds a new mode. Literally, new mode. Nintendo's so good at naming things. New mode makes the game easier by giving the Kongs more hit points and items. And if you die too many times in a stage, both versions will even give you the option to just show you how to play it and let you move on, although you don't get any of the collectibles this way. Watching a game instead of playing it would kind of miss the point for me, but hey, I was a kid who couldn't beat anything without a Game Genie once upon a time, and there's nothing wrong with having options. What's telling is that neither the puzzle pieces or the time attack medals even count towards your completion percentage. I love this approach. The developers are giving you the freedom and the incentive to play the game in the way that's the most fun for you. Of course, I'd find the puzzle pieces a lot more fun if the bonus stages they were tied to were more interesting. Now, I don't have a problem with puzzle pieces in stages, and in fact some of them are hidden really cleverly. Moments like this, where you have to notice the potential for the background elements to form a certain shape, are another indication of what a good fit Retro was for this project. But every single bonus stage just boils down to grabbing a bunch of stuff within a time limit. And there are only a handful of types. Like, the aesthetic is the only thing that differentiates World 1's bonus stages from World 8's. Even Donkey Kong Country 1 had slightly more variety than this, but I guess the original did also suffer from simplistic repetitive bonus stages, and since Returns is similarly kicking off a new series, I can give it a pass. This time. Unfortunately, one way it pales in comparison to the original is in its use of animal buddies. Or to be more accurate, the lack thereof. DKC1 had 4 rideable buddies, plus Squawks held a light in that one stage. In return, Squawks is also in a support role, and the most famous animal buddy is back, Rambi. True to the game's style, he's more powerful than ever, invincible to everything except fire, and to be fair, he is thrilling to play as, crashing through barriers and destroying set pieces, but he's only in 4 stages, and he's the only rideable buddy in the game. Like I said, I'll excuse some things in light of this being the first game in a new series. I do still wish there was a way to play as Diddy in single player, or to have him take point. I do wish other animal buddies and Kongs had shown up. I do think it loses something in terms of momentum, and the ability to switch characters lent the older games a little more variety. But in sacrificing this variability, Returns becomes more consistent than the classics. Bottom line is, the game design and the approach are very different, but that crunchy core is still there, and ultimately, it's as solid as ever. And boy does it need to be solid. I remember when the E3 reveal happened, there was a lot of concern about this. The heart meter in a Donkey Kong game! Oh, Nintendo. Cave into those filthy casuals again, are we? Remember when Nintendo made real games? But we were so wrong. It might let you take 2 hits per Kong, but DKC Returns turns out to be exponentially more difficult than its 16-bit ancestors. Nearly every stage has a gimmick that's taught via that old-school skill curve. The concept is introduced, then it's used in situation after situation, ever increasing in complexity, twisting as it goes with other gimmicks to create this exhilarating degree of challenge. Unlike the older games, and more obviously, unlike most 2D revivals of retro franchises, DKC Returns actually puts modern hardware to use to create hazards that never could have been done in 16-bit. Waves crash in from the background, flinging enemies and items alike and forcing you to seek out shelter. A freaking octopus chases you down through an entire level. Physics are often used in ways that the Super Nintendo just wasn't capable of, with platforms shifting under DK's weight and entire structures collapsing. But even a more traditional DKC element like blast barrels are so much more impactful in Returns. Just having a camera that can swing through the environment like this gives them a lot more scope. The pace tends to be way more frenetic than the older games, but I think in light of that, people forget that it's not just a bombastic spectacle. This is not like the difference between classic Sonic's momentum and platforming versus the Boost game's non-stop energy. Returns still has plenty of slower stages based around more traditional platforming. It has plenty of ambience. It's just not the same realistic ambience of the original game. Most famously, these silhouette stages are just breathtaking, and all 3 of them manage to convey a completely different feel. On the flip side, the minecart stages have been so bolstered by the Wii's hardware, they really do superannuate the classics, which makes a lot of sense. In those original games, these were already the bombastic, fast-paced stages, and Returns invigorates them with hazards and designs that never could have even remotely been done on the Super Nintendo. When the track starts breaking apart or getting cut in half, it can be such an adrenaline rush, and it's a testament to how well designed they are that I always feel like I have enough time to react to this stuff. They even incorporate platforming sections and vary things up now. Minecarts are just a perfect fit for the game's style. That ebb and flow between methodical precision platforming and all this spectacle makes the highs all the more thrilling. It really surprised me that a developer who never made a 2D platformer could practically master the pace of a game like this. Stages never overstay their welcome. Well, almost never. The counterpart to the minecarts are these new rocket barrel stages. They're also linear and vehicle-based, but they're not nearly as well designed. What kills it here are the controls. Or to be more accurate, the control, because all you can do is hold down the A button to ascend, and you automatically fall when it's not held down. There's this intentional lag that keeps you from changing directions too quickly, so there's a rhythm you have to master to even go in a straight line. Why is all of this screen real estate back here not being used? Oh, it's so they can put things behind you sometimes. Now you have to pay attention to dodging obstacles from 2 different directions with such limited controls when you die in 1 hit. Other stages constantly zoom the camera in and out, so why not just move the player forward when they want to do that? The late game rocket barrel stages in particular are the one time Returns really wore on me. They can be such a repetitive chore to get through. Well, technically I guess the rocket barrel isn't entirely new. Yeah, what a surprise. Josh is dismissive of something that's originating from DKC3. But this style of stage isn't anything like that game's, and the point stands. The vast majority of the music is made up of adaptations of tracks from the original game. Some have taken issue with this, but it never bothered me. I mean, most of the level tropes and even the setting itself are the same as Donkey Kong Country, so it feels right for the music to hail from it too. Especially since most of them are really strong remixes and are often put to use in new ways. Like, it's a great touch how the map screen music changes in each world now. For that matter, it's a great touch that the whole map is now just one big model. Makes the whole adventure feel nice and interconnected. Very occasionally, the melancholic DKC tracks don't gel well with the over-the-top approach, like when the tranquil, introspective aquatic ambience track plays, while a massive whale crashes through pirate ships. There are some new tracks as well, but they don't tend to be nearly as catchy or memorable. I mean, they're serviceable, but aping David Wise's greatest hits was the right call. I couldn't help but smile every time one of those old familiar tunes would hit. Due to how fast-paced and difficult this game is, it demands that you stay engaged. You can't really focus on anything else when you're playing Returns because it asks so much of you. I can kick back, relax, and speed through DKC 2 without really thinking about it. I mean, it used to be a hard game once upon a time, but even when it wasn't anymore, the flow of its design has kept me coming back all these years. Returns' much higher difficulty, coupled with its decreased emphasis on kinetic momentum, causes it to lose some replayability for me compared to the classics. I've beaten the original trilogy dozens of times, but this is only my third time through Returns. This might not be a game to relax with, but that's not at all a bad thing, and the difficulty really helped Returns stand out in the modern industry. It wasn't going to be able to set a new standard with its graphics the way the original did, so it makes up for that with its ability to challenge even those longtime gamers who loved and mastered those classics. Where the originals immersed you with an atmosphere that was unparalleled at the time, Returns immerses you through its mechanics, the way it forces you to stay aware of every action you take. In the hands of a less competent developer, levels so challenging might have felt like obstacle courses. But Retro Studios did their homework. An immersive, cohesive design is one of the most critical strengths of the Donkey Kong Country series. That concept was set back in the original game. It was way ahead of the curve, being realistic and atmospheric at a time when games couldn't usually be anything except cartoony. But by 2010, the industry had figured out atmospheric a little too well sometimes, and so DKC Returns goes for a more ostentatious style. Despite this, the level design is still rooted in believability. Platforms don't just float in midair, they're connected to the terrain. Now, very rarely I had trouble discerning that terrain from the foreground, like that ledge gets me every time, but the environment and the way the characters and enemies impact it are more believable than they ever could have been with pre-rendered tiled backgrounds. At the start of a new stage, you're usually even traversing out of the previous level's aesthetic. The attention to world building that Retro proved so capable of in the Prime series made them a perfect fit for Donkey Kong, and it's wonderful to see them get to go in a more vibrant direction. While many of the world themes are inspired by the original DKC, Retro only uses that as a jumping off point. For instance, before you can break back into Crimcroc Industries, you'll have to go through an entire world made up of these cliffs the factories are pumping oil into. This area was only previously visible on the original game's map screen, and when you do finally get into those factories, they're completely distinct in gameplay and tone from the originals. The factory might actually be one of my favorite worlds. There's a series of stages where you have to find switches to power up a rocket, puzzles that harken back to Retro's Prime pedigree, and even a short vertical rocket barrel stage that controls way better than the others. Unfortunately, the final world doesn't quite match that level of quality. It's in the volcano the Tikis erupted, and while that makes sense within the context of the story, well, look, the volcano destroyed one of Donkey Kong Island's most iconic frontiers, Gorilla Glacier, and I wish this world had a little more pathos. I wish it made the player feel the loss and the threat more. Calling back to those gorgeous ice caves, which are now pouring lava and melting as you traverse them, while listening to some menacing, somber remix of Slip Slide Ride, could have directly appealed to the emotions and the nostalgia of a player, and gotten them to want to seek vengeance against the enemies who did this. Instead of that, Returns Volcano is aesthetically just a very generic video game world. Although at least it is a new archetype, compared to DKC1's anticlimactic barrage of even more caves. Actually, I guess one neat way of looking at it is that these lava stages from DKC2 have long been rumored to have been designed for DKC1, but were cut for time. So I guess it's cool that we finally did get some kind of volcano on DK Isle. But this world is also the one part of the game where challenge sometimes passes over into cheapness. Look, the final world should definitely be hard, but when there's no reasonable way a player could have seen an obstacle coming unless they just decided to stop, it's too much trial and error. It's still an above average set of platforming stages, and the final silhouette stage is particularly phenomenal, but the world as a whole doesn't quite feel congruent with the level of quality the game's maintained to this point. And that speaks to something else I've noticed. When Retro Studios appropriated and modernized something from the classics, it tended to go well. The ground pound, the minecarts, Rambi, the approach to level design, the musical remixes, all of these are spectacular. But when Retro invented original concepts for this game, they aren't necessarily bad per se, they just don't tend to be as strong. The blowing mechanic, the rocket barrel, the new music, the enemy designs, and the final world, these all feel comparatively undercooked, like Retro is playing it a little too safe. And that also goes for one more thing. The bosses. Most of the original game's bosses were a bit dull, but they were also over in no time. As the series went on, the bosses got more complex and interesting, but aside from the end-game, a skilled player could always tear through any of them in a minute or two. Retro's bosses follow a more modern formula. They go through sequences that scale in difficulty, and I do still enjoy the majority of them, but I find they fall into the same trap that a lot of Metroid Primes did. The sequences repeat way too many times, testing the player for things that they've already proven they can do. It's frustrating, especially in the late game, to die to something that you couldn't have seen coming and have to repeat such a long fight. I actually asked one of Rare's writers, Chris Alcock, about Returns on Twitter, and without missing a beat, he made a crack about how long it takes to actually defeat a boss in this game. Though it should be noted, he also thinks Retro did a fantastic job bringing back the series, and thank you for allowing me the honor of quoting you, sir. The final boss of Returns is the mastermind behind the whole brutal, banana-thieving plot, Tiki Tak, set at the peak of DK Island. In contrast to most of his subordinates, I actually quite like his design. He's way more expressive than the rest of them, and the way he laughs and taunts the player makes him come across as unhinged and dangerous. Oh, and he is dangerous. He shoves just a small sampling of the banana horde into his top, and then... Retro, always expanding lore and making it make sense, because as we learn here, DK's banana horde has never just been a bunch of ordinary bananas. Eating them gives Tiki Tak a massive and magical boost in power, which after 16 years, justifies why Donkey Kong's enemies were always trying to steal them. But the actual fight against him is another example of Retro being a little too generic. Yeah, does this remind you of anything? Well, yeah, that one's obvious, but yep, there it is. On the bright side, he's tough as nails, and more importantly, has a flurry of cool attacks that never overstay their welcome. As is tradition, the final boss is also the best. Beating him triggers an explosion of magical energy that hurtles DK into space. Into space. What? Shouldn't the moon colliding with the planet cause more, I don't know, catastrophe than that? And, is it just gonna set that? No. Yeah. Oh, okay. This ending, and it pains me to say this, but this ending is even worse than Donkey Kong Country 3's. Like, yeah, dropping an egg on K. Rool was a horrible anticlimax, but at least it was tonally in line with the rest of the series. Returns tends to be much more over the top, but in every other instance it still maintains at least a degree of verisimilitude with what came before. But this ridiculous moonshot isn't even in line with how Returns has presented its world to this point. It veers way overboard into cartoony nonsense, and the moon somehow just plonking itself back into the sky is even worse. Ah well, the horde erupting out of the volcano is a great image to end on, and look, a golden temple's been revealed. Oh, they are building this thing up, but you need to beat all of those strenuous K-Temple stages to unlock it. Alright, Returns, I've beaten your worst. What's my reward? Huh. No, I don't even mind this. I don't know what was in that banana, but it was definitely magic, so I actually think this justifies itself a lot better than the ending. The music in this stage even remixes the DK Jr. theme, calling back to our modern Kong's origins. It breaks hard from the rest of the aesthetic to the point that it kind of feels like a completely different game, but that also means it really stands out. It's just one stage, but you're not gonna forget it. On the other hand, it's just one stage, yet it's so built up with cutscenes and hype, it feels like it's gonna be so much more substantial than it is, and oh look! It's the 3DS version. There, the Golden Temple still ends with that same whimsical stage, but prior to that, it's got an entire world to get through. These stages are, honestly, some of the more brilliantly designed levels in Returns, which is impressive considering that Retro Studios had nothing to do with them. No credit for that goes to the studio that ported Returns to the 3DS, Monster Games. And if they've proven themselves this capable, I wouldn't mind seeing them take the reins of the series if Retro is finished with it. So after all that, did this game live up to its promise? Did Retro Studio succeed in making Donkey Kong Country magic again? Well, I have spent a lot of time in this critique comparing Returns to the games that inspired it. There are things it did different, things it did better, and things it did worse, but the 16-bit Donkey Kong Country was undeniably the jumping-off point for the game design, and so comparing them like this is only fair. However, it is impossible for me to hold it up to those classics in a way that's remotely fair. Donkey Kong Country Returns was a game I loved playing when I was 22, but Donkey Kong Country 2 was a game that solidified my lifelong love of the medium when I was 8. It doesn't matter how good the newer game is, it's never going to be able to eclipse those memories. Keeping that in mind, I do think that Retro's game loses a degree of charm that the originals, even the third one, maintained. The lack of characters and animal buddies, and even the way the core gameplay has been changed, serve to de-emphasize the feeling of community, of cohesion, of style that Rare brought to the franchise. I want to stress again that defining what makes a game stick with you is incredibly subjective, especially when you're comparing a game that you played when you were a kid versus one that you played when you were were an adult. If I had played Returns when I was 8, I don't think I'd have noticed any of this stuff. And if I'm being honest, a lot of these criticisms didn't even occur to me until the sequel to this game fixed them. So it's not gonna stand up to my childhood nostalgia. So a few things about it feel tonally off. That doesn't take away from the fact that for 99% of the game, every time I've played it, I have had an amazing time. It's so solid, so fun, and most importantly, so challenging. To a degree that very few modern games are, especially ones that look like this. Find me another game released in the last 10 years that's this bright, this vibrant, and this tough. I think Retro had a reason to take this approach, and it speaks to their strength as a developer. Rareware made their name by taking Nintendo's concepts and building them to even greater heights. If you'll pardon the pun, they were that rare developer that could actually outplay Nintendo at their own game, and when the two companies aligned, it was pure magic. Retro Studios did not recapture that magic, but Reggie never said they would. He said they would make it magic again. And in that way, Retro Studios is an appropriate name, because just as they had done before, they proved themselves the masters of understanding the nuance of a franchise that had burned out generations before. 2D platformers were making a comeback in 2010, but most of them leaned hard on pure old-school appeal. There's nothing wrong with that, but Retro Studios isn't about iterating on what worked 20 years ago. And I'd even argue that a straight remake of DKC in a 3D engine would have been counter to what made it special in the first place. So Retro took the risky path, and in doing so, raised the bar of what a 2D platformer should be in the modern era without losing the soul of what made the series legendary. Donkey Kong Country Returns is a magical game, not because another game was magic 20 years ago, but because Retro Studios made it their own. It is, far and away, my favorite game on the Wii. After a few years of uncertainty, Nintendo was ready to make games like this again. Donkey Kong had returned to prominence, and this one game would go on to single-handedly outsell the entire Metroid Prime trilogy. Back at E3 2010, right before Returns was revealed actually, a brand new Metroid game was shown off. Perhaps that raises a question. If Returns really was that much of a success, then how come when a sequel was announced, those hardcore Nintendo fans who should have loved it reacted like this? Next week, we'll find out when I take a plunge into Tropical Freeze. For just $1 a month, patrons can see it right now a week early. For $3, you can binge the entire completed season, and my milestone bonus this time will be for a game that nearly killed a franchise, Metroid Other M. Thanks for watching, you keep geekin', I'll keep critiquin'.